here on Nigeria Info. Welcome back to Hard Facts.
This is.
I don't know what that is about, but sometimes the systems do glitch. Sorry about that. Abuja, thank you very much for staying with 95.1 Nigeria Info. It's 4 minutes after 5. And it's time to get down to the next conversation. I see tons of comments reacting to what I played earlier on from Senator Abo. But, we'll keep that in the cooler for a bit and get back to it much, much later. I've got a guest with me in the studio, and we'll be looking at wide-ranging issues today as we look at not just our relations, talking about the bilateral relations we share between Belgium and Nigeria, but also looking at beyond Nigeria, Africa, and other global stories today. And like I mentioned earlier on, we'll explore how Belgium is engaging with Nigeria and Africa at a time of major global shift. There are a lot of conflict zones around the world, migration issues. So it's going to be a conversation about not just diplomacy, but shared interest and then the future of international cooperation. I'm excited because I've got with me in the studio the Ambassador of Belgium to Nigeria, His Excellency Pieter Leenknegt. You're welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you here in the studio.
Really delighted to have you in the studio with us. And trust you're enjoying every bit of your stay in Nigeria.
Absolutely. I'm just back from Taraba. We were in Sokoto just 10 days ago. And I also enjoy my days in Abuja.
That is good to know. That is good to know. Taraba, Sokoto State are all like extreme north, but it comes with its own unique experience also. All right, so we're still in the Europe month. The whole of May is Europe month, and we're privileged some weeks back where we had the EU ambassador to Nigeria and ECOWAS in the studio and had so much to talk about. And seeing that we're still in the month, we'll start off the conversation looking at the bilateral relations we share between Belgium and Nigeria. And I want to believe it's healthy. But Ambassador, tell us, are there new or emerging areas of cooperation between our countries, Belgium and Nigeria? And maybe a little hint as to which sector is attracting investors.
Yes. Well, I think as a general matter, the relations are quite thriving. They go swimmingly. And if even Davido says that he would rather gonna go buy Belgium, then there must be something appealing to that place for Nigerians, I expect. So he's also basically coming over to one of our music festivals in the summer. But of course, that is not necessarily close to our diplomatic relations as such. Whereas, for instance, last week, in Brussels, we had a visit of the Nigeria Defense College, which was also quite long in the making. Our Africa director will be visiting here in July. We'll have the opening of a brand new embassy building in the EU compound before the end of the year, where we hope to get our foreign minister also visiting. And we have also fantastic go-between persons, as I would call them, either Nigerians who have studied in Belgium, then come back and do very well as entrepreneurs, or Belgians who've lived here for the longest time. And for instance, one of those Nigerians that was trained in Belgium, there will be the launch soon of an online cooperative bank for women in July in our embassy. And as we speak, that lady is now also talking to the Belgian investment company and development countries, in developing countries, in order to also have them come in to that endeavor. And there's chambers of commerce in Brussels and in Lagos that are very active nowadays, sometimes also kind of revived after a few years of interlude, so to speak. We're setting up a network of Nigerian alumni who were at Belgian universities, and we might also be celebrating later in this year the life of Deinde Fernandez, one of the most iconic diplomats in Nigerian history, who retired and passed on in Belgium exactly 10 years ago. But when it comes now to the emerging areas of cooperation, I'd say there's two things that I would like to highlight. One is that since a few years we see increased interest and incoming investment from the Belgian side in the medical sector at large. This is about, for instance, maintaining and servicing dialysis machines or bandages for complex wounds, but also, for instance, plans to start producing local mRNA type vaccines here in Nigeria
Awesome.
with Belgian know-how, or cold chain techniques that work in countries that cannot guarantee 24/7 power supply. So all of this is coming in. I'd say in the case of some of these companies, some of them also being startups, it's what you could call still baby steps, because what I heard, I mean, an advice that a Kenyan friend from a long time ago gave me before coming to Nigeria was that I would need 3 things with a P: patience, prudence, and Panadol. Now, this is where the patience comes in. And that's also something that our investors sometimes need to show, patience until the right moment comes. But I'll probably deal with the prudence and the Panadol later down the line, but not now. Another tendency, but now I will talk in the other direction, is that we actually now also have a Nigerian investment in Belgium. So there was a palm oil plantation group from Belgium that was bought by a Nigerian group with those interests, and accidentally or accessorily, they also bought a horticultural firm near my birthplace, Ghent, in Belgium. It's something that hasn't really been picked up in the Nigerian media, a bit more in the Belgian media, but I want to highlight it because I think it's also a sign of what trade and investment in the 21st century can be and should be, going in both directions. So that's definitely also, hopefully, the beginning of a new trend.
Interesting. When I think about Belgium, there's so much that comes to mind, but we always talk about our stockfish coming from there. We have the largest supply coming from Belgium. So it's interesting that you're bringing that perspective in at this point in time. And you did, Ambassador, you mentioned in passing the cultural festival with Davido. Tell us a bit more about it. When is it coming up?
Well, that is actually a mainstream summer festival in Belgium. So we have tens and I'd say perhaps hundreds of summer festivals in Belgium that all, I'd say, almost stumble over each other. Like literally there's almost no summer day in Belgium that passes without a summer music festival happening. But some of them are also very tailored to particular types of music, either world music or, for instance, Afrobeats and so on. So if I'm not mistaken, Davido is coming to the Cactus Festival in Bruges, which I also attended many years back. And it's just quite eclectic. I mean, all kinds of types of music are being catered for there.
All right. That is good to know. At least Nigerians knew that now. Away from just talking about Nigeria, there's so much happening around the world, and I would love your opinion and your take on some of them. And starting off with one of the latest, which affects Europe also, alongside almost every country of the world. But the President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, is imposing a 50% tariff on EU goods, and many see this as a threat to trade, transatlantic trade and the global economy. And I'm a little curious to know how your country, Belgium, and Europe generally is preparing for the possibility of this kind of shift, where some people have profiled it as aggressive shift in the US trade policy.
Sure, yes. Thank you for that question. And actually, there was a bit of newly incoming news, because the news you just served me is the one from like 2-3 days ago.
Still.
Now, this morning on my Belgian radio news, there was now the announcement that this would be again postponed, this measure, the 50%, until, was it 9th of June or 9th of July? And so that...
beyond the initial postponement of 90 days initially.
Yeah, but there's now another postponement coming again from the American side. So basically, and I think it's just, I'd say, an example of what's actually going on. We are in this logic, or I'd even say in the illogic of announcement and counter-announcement. And it's kind of like a movement that only harvests mostly confusion, I would say. And I've been a former Belgian trade delegate to the WTO twice, in 2001 and 2007-11. So there are a few things that I can definitely share from the top of my mind about all of this. And the first thing is, I think the EU will be fine, because the EU is big enough as a trading bloc to use its leverage and to use just its own trade volume as leverage. The challenge is more systemic. And I'd say it's more unfair, mostly towards smaller nations and smaller trading blocs. Because even if everybody reaches an individual deal with the United States on this, it still breaks the multilateral trading system apart. the system that we set up in 1944, and which has a certain transparency and fairness to it. And these unilaterally enforced tariffs, they make things very complicated, and they make it also cumbersome, both for traders and authorities alike. For instance, what about special treatment for least developed countries that was, arranged across the board in a systemic way in the WTO? Is that all now falling apart because the US is kind of like negotiating a specific tariff with each one individually? So it really doesn't make much sense. Secondly, what I would say, the Trump administration clearly confuses, in the case of Europe, tariffs with product safety and environmental standards. They treat them alike, and they're absolutely not alike, because tariffs, to some extent, can be individualized, and development status, but product safety and environmental standards, you really don't play with it. They have to be applicable to all, and they can't just be wished away or negotiated away. And thirdly, but it's in the same vein, I mean, Belgium or Europe are not ripping off the US in world trade, as sometimes is alleged on some of these social media handles. What I would compare is a personal computer and a car. I, as a consumer, would not hesitate to buy a personal computer from the United States because, comparatively, I think they have an edge over many others. When it comes to a car, in the 80s, you would find lots of Europeans who would fancy American cars, no more, except perhaps for one brand of electric vehicles that is now in trouble for other reasons, not so much for the quality standards of the product. But American cars nowadays in Europe, mostly, let's be frank, people associate them with substandard finish or gas-guzzling energy inefficiency. So you really don't make your own products more competitive or palatable to world markets by shielding them from foreign competitors with tariffs or other measures. It's quite the contrary, actually. So that's another handicap, or something that has to enter in the mindset, and that has been in the world trade mindset for so long, for all of us. I'd add also that almost nobody has ripped off the US in global trade, except perhaps China, which since its WTO membership in 2001, just when I came into Geneva also the first time, so it's still fresh in my memory. So the China has often played some WTO rules a bit dubiously, I must say. Government procurement markets, opening those up for instance, is one of those things. But it hasn't done so only vis-à-vis the US, but towards all trading nations. So, and even these US tariffs will not adequately address most of those imbalances generated by China either. So you really have to address them probably through other means. And a difficult one, and that's my last point about all of this, is that the challenge is to some extent not only about Trump when it comes to WTO. The sabotage by the US of the trade court function of the WTO, the appellate body, it started in the Obama years. Because at that
predates
time,
it.
Yes. So during the Obama years, the United States refused to basically vote on some candidates for the appellate body until the time there were no more judges enough there in the appellate body to rule any cases. So that was a very deliberate move there. And most states in the WTO, they cherish predictability and precedent value, also in what I would call informally the World Trade Court. The US, however, they seem to value power politics in negotiations, even over the adjudication of cases. So that is a bit of a cultural clash. US exceptionalism. It's a bit of a, I'd say, a cowboy attitude that apparently permeates more than just the MAGA Republicans. So I'm sure that some accommodation towards the US could be made even in that area. Yeah. But the margins for it are also rather limited. At the same time, it's very hard to imagine how a multilateral trade system could work with the US on the outside. So we also have an interest to keep the US inside. Still, I think, at the time when I entered as a WTO diplomat, they represented something like 25% of world trade.
Okay. I guess the United States alone?
Oh, yeah. And then Europe, pretty much the same thing. Then you had Japan, Canada. And basically, if you brought those four countries together, you already lumped together 60 to 70% of world trade. And then basically what happened is the other ones agreed with others. Not really exactly very representative in terms of the global community, but that's how it happened. I've seen that also change, even during the years of my stay in
Nigeria.
Geneva. That was clear. Geneva. At that time. But still, U.S. trade probably is still around something like 20% of world trade, let's say.
And that's significant. That's huge, actually.
So you can't just also have those people on the outside, as with many other things.
So I want to believe a diplomatic approach is what the EU and your country would take in handling this particular one.
Yes, exactly, but also with an eye for preserving a rules-based multilateral system, which we really want to defend across the board, also in many other areas around the world.
All right.
And that is a bit of a challenge as for now.
Indeed, indeed. Well, we'll continue to follow the trend and see how it pans out at the end of the day. Just before we get into the Russian-Ukraine development, which is a bit troubling, let's get your take on migration. Yeah, it's, the world is a global village. People move around quite a lot, and migration remains a deeply geopolitical issue. So what's Belgium, position on creating fair migration policy that just goes beyond the security concerns you have around the world and in Nigeria to something a bit more coherent, say development cooperation with African countries and Nigeria precisely?
Sure, and Belgium was the EU Council of Ministers rotating presidency in the first half of 2024, and that was also a time when I believe that Belgium was quite instrumental in shaping the common European rules on pathways for legal migration, circular migration, temporary labor migration, and all of that, because member states have some leeway to actually organize that, but you also have to set those general rules. And that's where Belgium, as a founding father of the EU, and usually also quite an honest broker when we have those presidencies, can come in. And in that way, we're not only working for, a migration relation with our 11 million inhabitants, but with the 450 Europeans as such. And that process is still ongoing of fleshing out all these rules, but I think we are getting there. And likewise, our embassy and our country's development agency attended the thematic meeting of the Rabat process on the same in Abuja 2 weeks ago. And I think, yes, we can match the employment and upskilling needs of young Africans while addressing some of the needs of an aging European population. But it's also important, I think, to be mindful that we will not solve all of Africa's problems with migration to Europe, even with circular migration. And also that unemployment in most African countries is also not the root cause in itself of many problems, but rather a symptom of further deeper root causes, such as that need to be tackled, such as economic inequality and unchecked population growth. And these frankly, are problems that need to be tackled by Africa itself, mostly, and rather than by Europe.
When you mentioned population, I had this smile on my face, a smirk more like, because I can understand how the continent is growing. We have a largely youthful population and more children. We have tons of kids out of school, and then you're dependent on countries who are managing their population a bit more. So it is an African problem that needs to be resolved with the policies the government introduce at the end of the day. But if we don't sort ourselves, it becomes a burden to every other person, and that's why interventions also are necessary from these countries, European countries, where we have significant number of people migrating to even irregularly. It is a concern for them also. So I'm glad I mentioned that Africa needs to sort some of these things out. Yeah,
but let me also add a few other, I think, rules of thumb that I've gathered through our migration-related work here in Nigeria over the last months and years. That is, one, yes, offering legal pathways is in itself, I think, a sound thing to do, both for Europe and for Africa. But it's also a bit of a misunderstanding, or it's a logic that we don't buy for not just seeing it happening. That by offering legal pathways, that then somehow the irregular migration pathway will just dry up by itself. And even, I must say, in terms of cooperation you get from countries to stem irregular migration from their territory, or taking back people who clearly had no valid claim, that is not an automaticity. The goodwill you build with the legal pathways is not necessarily transferring into goodwill on the other track.
Yeah.
And my Canadian colleagues will be the first ones to actually confirm that. They have the largest number of Nigerian legal migrants going to their country, but are still facing issues with, kind of dealing with the consequences of irregular migration.
Yeah. Oh.
So that is definitely a fact as well. Also, let me be clear, when it comes to some of what I called the root causes, I'd say the primary responsibility there is for Africa. It doesn't mean that we can't also be helpful in tackling those. Income inequality is eventually going to be a matter of how you set up a tax system, and that we cannot do in anybody's place.
All right. Let's go on a quick break. Ambassador will be back with more. Stay with us. Hello, my name is Kimberly. I'm the host of Hard Facts, and I bring you the biggest stories driving conversation every weekday here on 95.1 Nigeria Info Hard Fact Show. I love to get your opinion and conjectures, but the facts you cannot dispute here on Hard Facts. Join me and let's talk. Yes, the conversation continues with the ambassador of Belgium to Nigeria, His Excellency Pieter. Leenknegt. And we've been talking a whole lot about our relations, diplomatic relations between both countries, Belgium, Nigeria, and looking at global geopolitical issues also. From the trade tariff, which our guest mentioned, it's on hold for now for a few days, and we'll see what interesting turn it will take, and giving us an idea of how Belgium and EU perhaps would engage the United States on this particular one there. Ambassador, let's go on to something else that is huge. And I mean, it's happening on your continent and affects the entire world. Russia recently launched its largest air attack on Ukraine. I mean, since the war started. This is huge, for even the United States president to be worried about what is going on there. Now, as a key EU and NATO member, how is Belgium responding to this escalation? What does this really signal about the trajectory of the war and, security concerns, really, EU's security posture?
Well, I mean, Russia is clearly not in a hurry to accept the ceasefire, I think, is what we should gather from all of this. And this is in spite of American and other efforts to bring them to the negotiating table or bring them to book and we've also seen a clearly voiced intention now on the Ukrainian side to come to a negotiating table, but that's apparently not the case for Russia yet. So, I mean, Belgium as the host country for both EU and NATO and an erstwhile member of both shares this concern of virtually every other European country. And I'd say of many non-European countries for that matter. A concern about this very serious breach to the international security architecture, which the Russian full-fledged invasion in Ukraine represented and continues representing. And this is also a broader challenge, of course, to the post-World War II rules-based world order in terms of security and one afflicted by a permanent member of the Security Council. And in that world order, you can't just invade a country or call in bomber jets as soon as there's like a shadow of a doubt that your linguistic minorities in a neighboring country are treated unfairly in, say, education matters, for instance. Right? So territorial integrity is sacrosanct, and it was even explicitly guaranteed by Russia, by treaty in the case of Ukraine. And a word we hear more and more often in the political analysis these days, and even in literary essays, I would say, is a predator. How both in the corporate world and in global politics, you see predatory behavior take over in the attitude of some big power players. And the EU and Belgium stand against that very firmly. And there I could quote also the Kenyan ambassador to the UN in New York at the time in 2022, at the start of this Ukraine war, Martin Kimani. He said something like, if bigger countries are allowed to attack smaller neighbors just like that, then virtually all countries in the world are in danger. Indeed. Except perhaps for a few of these big predators, right? And I think there's a very big misunderstanding which Russia actively promotes and keeps alive on all of this. And that is that Russia was somehow or is threatened by NATO enlargement or what they call eastward expansion of NATO. And often to understand the falsehood of an argument, it's important to take a step back and watch the bigger picture. And here I would bring in, I'd say, a Gaza-West Bank analogy. And because you can, I think, only understand Israel's plans with Gaza if you realize that even in the West Bank, where there's no Hamas and has been no major terror attack as of late or hostage-taking, Israel still allows aggressive colonial settlers to uproot olive trees, chase Palestinians from their homes, squeeze them out of their territory that was assigned to them by international law and international consensus, and also fire warning shots when people from our consulate general in Jerusalem go and visit parts of West Bank and so on. So in that way, I think it also kind of points at a falsehood of some arguments that are used about Gaza. Now, likewise, I think it's only possible to understand the Russian attitude in Ukraine as a post-imperial itch by looking at Moldova. Because in Moldova, in Transnistria in 1992 already, Russian troops, post-Soviet troops that then morphed into Russian troops, already occupied a chunk of territory that had absolutely nothing to do with Russia, wasn't even contiguous to Russia. right? And they decided to keep those troops there in 2002. And guess what? A breakaway republic all of a sudden originated. And so in 1992, there was no NATO enlargement whatsoever. Yet Russia already occupied the territory outside its borders illegally. And we drew a blind eye to that, and we did it again in 2008 when, they started occupying Georgian territories, and again, to some extent in 2014 in Crimea and Donbass, except for a few sanctions. But, at some point, the threat to the system just becomes too big to ignore, too unbearable. And again, in a bit of a similar vein of what I told you about the systemic issues we have with the United States and the WTO, we also have here something. It's always wrong to personalize things too much in international politics. Everybody focuses a lot on President Putin. But as the Moldovan example proved, this is not just a Putin issue. 1992 was the Yeltsin years, the post-Gorbachev years immediately. So it's actually the hard part we have to confront to some extent here is that there is also a bit of a lingering underlying attitude with this imperialist attitude with Russian society at large, not just one strongman. And so I think it's all the more important than to give a voice by those Russians inside and outside of Russia who challenge that mentality. But it's not just a one-man issue, If Putin goes tomorrow,
somebody else feels the issue.
Exactly. There were some of his opponents who were also very strongly opposed to the campaign in Ukraine. Some other ones aren't so much.
Well, you talked about the collective imperialist stance of the Russian, and he said somebody else might just feel, it would take us back to how the Cold War ended. He took a man who saw differently, Gorbachev, am I getting his name right, who thought, let's do it a little differently. Already our economy is threatened, and he took a different direction. Who knows? Somebody different from a Putin ideology might just coming, but no one can tell how much damage will be done before then.
Yes, well, it's true. Let's keep that hope alive. But even if that, prodigal person doesn't come in, we might still have to negotiate with President Putin because, unfortunately, you don't choose your partners at the international negotiating table always.
You did mention something in passing, Ambassador, when you talked about sanctions. And, somebody sent in a message now and is a little curious as to the impact of the sanction that is coming from the EU generally, if it's having any impact whatsoever on Russia, because it doesn't seem to be slowing that country down.
Well, it's just one of those factors, right? There are important sanctions in place, and there's even, I think, a few other important sticks behind the door, as we call them, in a country that we could still mobilize at some point. The sanction package just increased. But of course, the equation for Russia is made by a number of things. International oil price, for instance, is also going to be such an important factor on how much firepower Russia keeps. And that is one that the EU doesn't control, EU and partners for that matter. Also, how much Russia can rely on other partners is also an important variable. Of course, we do all we can and all we can muster, but we are also only one power bloc in the world. And of course, the EU, at least in terms of political persuasion, tries to also get everybody on board because we believe the argument we make and the point we make is a systemic one that holds value also for other places in the world. I think Russia can make that argument by far not with the same strength, and I think rather has what we would call opportunistic partners. Countries who are equally in trouble with internationally unlawful behavior, but then stick their bandwagon to the Russian locomotive because this is where they can get support, whereas previously they were perhaps totally isolated. You can come up with a few of these countries.
One or two comes to mind.
Right?
The north of somewhere.
Yes.
Without leaving at that. Okay, there's just so much happening, and even in Africa, we have a bit fair share of crises and upheavals in some countries. But let's touch on one, and seeing that somehow there is a bit of a history with your country and that particular country, that's the Democratic Republic of Congo. So, if it's not too much to ask, what is Belgium's current role? What's your responsibility? I mean, we're looking at it both from a moral perspective, seeing that it's a former colony, and diplomatically also in addressing the crisis in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Yeah, let's start with the easier one, the role. Well, that role is a bit diminished for the moment. At least if the role that we would carve out for ourselves would be the one of a direct mediator, then that role is diminished, because since Rwanda broke off diplomatic relations with Belgium a few weeks ago, most unfortunately, we think that was quite a drastic measure. So we remain in the background, ready to assist, but for the direct mediation, clearly we'll have to look into the direction of other countries or other actors on the international scene. There is also a bit of an issue of territorial integrity here in this conflict. I mean, not exactly similar or identical to the one with Russia-Ukraine, but there is just no way that Rwanda can carve out some kind of a protectorate in the Eastern DRC and the existing international rules-based order. But it's also important, I think, for the DRC not always look to the outside world to solve its own problems. Belgium was always in favor of having multinational troops presence in the Eastern DRC to keep the peace, to stabilize and all of that. But even those troops will never bring development in itself or make the state's presence felt in that part of the country. So that's also an important assessment to make, I think. There is also a role to play for the countries involved, and definitely when it comes to developing, unlocking a part of their territory, however immense and big it would be. Now, when it comes to responsibility, and I heard you flag the term moral responsibility, I don't honestly think Belgium has a particular moral responsibility for the current standoff between the DRC and Rwanda. And yes, in the past decades, we have made amends for wrongs committed during the colonial era in the DRC, Belgium's colonial era. That's, without hesitation, there was an apology by the king, who interestingly can also represent his family for the period when his forefather basically had Congo as his private property in some part of the later 19th century, but he could also make that apology on behalf of the country as a whole for the colonial era that came afterwards, from 1908 until 1960. We also had the issue of the separation of mixed-race children from their parents a few decades ago, for which there was there were measures in place, an apology taken and all of that. And perhaps still more could be done. I'm totally cognizant of that. Though in many ways we already did more than certain other former colonizing nations from Europe. But it's also important, I think, to realize that the DRC, like most African countries, has now been roughly independent for as long as it has been colonized. So I think that is an important realization here. Time has passed, other people have taken the baton, and you could also assume that these countries
should be on their feet and do things for themselves.
Exactly, and also cater for their bilateral relations with neighbors without looking at a former colonial power. Then, whether we are diplomatically responsible, in this case, chip in. Well, we have many people-to-people relations in and with the DRC. That's, there's no doubt about it. And we also I hear that often from my colleagues and ministers, and that we call it our area of expertise diplomatically. But, sometimes mantras like these can also become a little bit self-defeating or delusional even. Some people in Belgium sometimes wonder what are billions of tax money poured into the DRC over the past decades in terms of development cooperation can show for in terms of actual deliverables. And for instance, there's also often the question, even in recent policy documents in Belgium, where we say, have the economic relations with the Great Lakes region, and what we then usually mean is just where our former colonies were, have they actually reached their full potential? I would sometimes phrase that question otherwise. If we've had, 6 decades of colonial rule there and 6 decades of post-colonial relations, and those economic relations are still a bit suboptimal compared to other regions in the world, isn't it time to look elsewhere and start, on a fresh footing elsewhere? And I think our French colleagues are also showing that in perhaps an even more explicit way. They have a bit of a complicated relation with some countries, former colonies here in the sub-region. But wherever I go, being posted in Nigeria, Kenya, and I see the French operate, French companies, also embassies in English-speaking Africa. They're thriving. They have the most fantastic joint ventures, which are also very much appreciated by their African counterparts and so on. So in the same vein, if you look at bilateral trade between Belgium and the DRC, it's just a fraction of the actual trade we now have between Belgium and Nigeria.
Oh.
So for me, it brings me back to the Belgian-Nigerian bilateral relations because, I'm one of those diplomats who has never put Kinshasa on his diplomatic wish list, on places to be sent to. I'd rather much go to places where we don't bear the burden. And some people say the benefit of the past, but also not that burden. And where we can start a new story.
Yeah.
And so that's how we end up in a place like Nigeria. Even South Africa. Even with South Africa, we have a trade many times bigger than with the DRC nowadays. But Nigeria is a case in point. Nigeria is even bigger in trade volumes than South Africa when it comes to Belgium.
Oh, all right. Amazing. Nigerians, hope you heard that part. Because James sent in a message and said, Kim, I didn't quite catch the ambassador's response to a question about Belgian investors and potential for growth. So let's go back to that question as to the sectors in Nigeria currently that attracts Belgian investors, and then the potential for growth in those areas.
Sure. I'm happy to actually to comment a bit on that. It's a very diverse landscape already, I must say. You mentioned stockfish. Yeah. We actually have a shrimp fishing firm from Belgium in Lagos.
Oh.
But we also have a joint venture in Enugu and in Ikeja that builds roofing materials that are very affordable for the average Nigerian. We have companies that do transport of chemicals. We have people who do palm oil processing. We have major dredging companies. The whole of Eco-Atlantic is actually being claimed on the sea by a Belgian dredging company.
Ah.
Yeah. The Netherlands built that wall. That's where they're very good at, building walls to keep the sea at bay. But then the hinterland is basically claimed by the Belgians. Absolutely. And that's also based on harking back at experiences we have in Port of Antwerp and that hinterland. But we do it all over the world. We're also having now a Belgian company that's selected to do a complex environmental cleanup work in the Niger Delta.
Oh.
Yeah, the
Ogoni land? Ogoni cleanup?
Yes, absolutely. There. Okay. Yeah, I was in Port Harcourt and I spoke to the high prep people there and all that. So that's an exciting new area also of activity. Now, Belgians are also running and operating ports and airports, sometimes as individual managers, but also sometimes as Port of Antwerp, coming in with joint ventures here, or actually people with their construction firms building brand new airports. I was in Taraba, as I said, recently. A Belgian there, together with T.Y. Danjuma, built a spick and span brand new airport in Kashimbila, which is quite something. Oh. Also in the finish, the design, it looks better than most Belgian airports I've actually seen in my life, I must say. But that's probably for being newer than most of the Belgian airports. So we also, in terms of sports, we have football scouting going on, tourism. I mean, the whole Taraba experience there comes also with the construction of lodges, hotels, and all of that. So that is also new. Where we want to see some growth is, what I say is, I often say 2025 is going to be about farm and pharma between Belgium and Nigeria. We'll have a big event on, the health value chain, with all these, that interest that I already mentioned in terms of the medical sector. But we will also have an incoming trade and investment mission in November that will be specifically focused on the food sector in a broad sense. So again, about cold chain solutions for fruit and vegetables, or treating agricultural waste to energy to make those agricultural plants work, and so on. But also, the chicken farmer who wants to see how he can deal with all those import bans and perhaps make a joint venture with companies here, get into processing, all of that. So all of that is actually going on as we speak.
Wow, it seems like quite a lot is going on, really. I see my phone lines buzzing, and if you have any question, feel free to ask. I can take a call or two. We don't have much time, so perhaps maybe one phone call, and then you can send in your questions. Call me up on 0700 951 0000. Straight to the point, please. Hello.
Hello, Oklora.
You're welcome.
I greet our guests. Good evening, sir. I'm Donatus calling from Niger State.
Go ahead, Donatus.
I just want to ask the ambassador, the country that make up NATO, what efforts are they doing to make sure that peace come back to Ukraine and what is their name?
Between Ukraine and Russia.
Yes.
All right.
What effort are they making? Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you very much. Let's take the second one quickly. Hello. Dear, I think I got to you a little late, but his concern is one question that I think you touched some bit of it. Hello?
Kimberly.
Yes, you're welcome.
Thank you. Maxman calling from Apple.
Go ahead, Maxman.
Yeah. I want to ask our guest, Israel Gaza, what are they doing about the Palestinians?
All right.
Why are they allowing Palestinians to be starved? Since when has hunger become a weapon of war? Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. Thank you very much. Guys, I see my phone lines buzzing. I see you have tons of questions to ask, but we don't have all of the time. So, Ambassador, I'll let you respond to, these bits that have come in.
Yes. I mean, when it comes to the first question on how to bring back peace to Ukraine, I mean, for now, it's mainly a story of siding with a country that was attacked and that was aggressed, and making sure that they can stand their ground now, and also then thwarting, the enthusiasm and the appetite for invasion by the other one. Now, of course, eventually you can't just keep that thing going on. It's wasteful for everybody. So many resources could be better invested than in a war machine. But for now, it's basically just defending a territory against outside aggression. At some point, countries will have to sit around the table, and then what Belgium and the EU can do also, of course, is to cushion Ukraine in terms of creating some expectations, perhaps on future EU membership, security guarantees, and all of that. But in the end, it's Russia which will have to be brought back to reason.
All right.
And we just mobilize the world in favor of Ukraine for the time being. Now, the other question I didn't quite catch. I heard something about cancer and about using starvation as a weapon
he was
of war.
talking about Gaza.
Gaza, sorry.
Hunger is used as a weapon of war against Palestinians.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think the UN Secretary General is also speaking out about it louder than ever. And of course, that is totally unacceptable and should not be allowed. We have also our Belgian Development Cooperation Agency working in Gaza and in the West Bank. And as early as a few weeks into that war, even their office got bombed. Now, to me, that and mining universities with an army are clear signs that this is not just about fighting terrorists, because, for goodness sake, Belgian Development Cooperation Agency in Palestine is not some kind of a terrorist bastion, and it got bombed pretty much like any other structure. So of course, and I'm cognizant, there's many hospitals, so that you can wonder, like, after 2 years of war, why would Hamas still be hiding in hospitals? Because if these are now also like prime targets, then it also begs that question and all of that. So yes, we are also watching in horror in seeing this still develop almost 2 years on, Yes, at some point we are also supporting the ICC in its endeavors in bringing everybody to book, both the Hamas terrorists who committed the terrorist attack,
7, yeah.
but also the Israeli responsibles for this military campaign with no end in sight. And clearly also using techniques and using methods that are by no means justified under international humanitarian law.
Well, I don't know where time went, but it went by really fast. But Benga sent in a comment. It says, your guest said he was born in, is it Gent or Ghent?
Ghent.
So he's asking the correct pronunciation of both towns. If you believe that Ghent, where he was born, can do better than the league leader Ghent in football. It's this football talk. At this point,
Football talk. Well, let me help you with this one.
All right.
The way we pronounce it in Dutch is Gent.
Ghent.
Yes.
All right.
So, but Ghent is the correct English pronunciation.
Oh.
For those who have a trouble with all these gutturals, then it's Ghent. It's definitely not Gent, and that's why we write an H in English behind it. And the name of the football club in Dutch is Gent with just a G, but we pronounce that. We help you with the H to get it as close as possible.
All right. Well, let's go on a very quick break. We'll be back to wrap this up.
Like a big mansion, you only see the magnificent edifice, not the strong foundation that holds it. Likewise, in the world of e-payments, you only see transactions done and funds remitted. But who pioneered these financial technology solutions? Well, you knew it as Value Card, now Unified Payments. Nigeria's premier financial tech.
This is Nigeria Info.